Just today, for example, there was oral argument in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in the Texas versus United States case, a monumental case that has the potential to cause millions of Americans to lose coverage. We know that because we know that since the Affordable Care Act was passed, more than 20 million people gained coverage. The larger share of that being people who gain coverage through the expansion of Medicaid. Those 20 million Americans, if this case were to be successful, a case brought by Republican attorneys general from around the country, then later opposed by Democratic attorneys general, if that case were successful, as it was at the district court level, 20 million people stand to lose their coverage, and a much larger number, depending on which number is on the record currently, but it's at least 150 million plus Americans have protections today because of the Affordable Care Act, like the protection if you have a pre-existing condition. You could be, under the old system, the old rules, the old law, you could be denied treatment or coverage because you had a pre-existing condition. That was happening routinely. That is no longer the law today. The law today is if you have a pre-existing condition, you can still have coverage. That would be at risk for, as I said, something north of 150 million Americans. We know that some of the data tells us that the numbers are equally substantial when it comes to different parts of the law and those who are adversely or potentially adversely affected. And I think if you had to step back and summarize where we've been in the last more than just about 2.5 years now, since the Trump administration came into office, working with House Republicans and Senate Republicans, you've had a campaign, really, a constant campaign of what I would argue is a campaign about three things, and maybe not only three, but at least three. Ripping away coverage, decimating the Medicaid program, or at least trying to, attempting to over and over again, and thirdly, sabotage. Sabotage mostly by the administration itself, but also supported by Republicans here in the Congress. That sabotage, unfortunately, has been successful. We know that as of January, for example, the Gallup organization released data that said that the number of Americans, and I'm reading from the first line of a news story, this is from the publication Vox, V-O-X. The headline is, "Under Trump, the number of uninsured Americans has gone up by 7 million. The subheadline is, "Even in a strong economy, Americans are losing their health coverage." This is an article written by Sarah Cliff, someone who spends a lot of time writing about and analyzing healthcare as an issue. It's dated January the 23rd, 2019. But in this particular article, I'll read just the first two sentences. Quote, "The number of Americans without health insurance has increased by 7 million since President Donald Trump took office, new Gallup data released Wednesday shows." Again, this is a January 2019 story. It goes on from there to say, and I quote, "The country's uninsured rate has steadily ticked upward since 2016, rising from a low of 10.9% in late 2016 to 13.7%, a 4-year high," unquote. So at the end of 16, at the beginning of the Trump administration, the uninsured rate was 10.9. At the end of, or the latter part of 2018, going into 2019, it stood at 13.7. So Gallup tells us 7 million more people do not have health care that had it when the president started his administration. A number of organizations have cataloged recent analyses of the potential threats that could impact communities if this Texas versus United States case were successful. And I'll mention again for the record the litigants here, the ones who were bringing the case, these Republican attorneys general, prevailed at the district court level. Now it's on appeal at the circuit court, and it's probably, in my judgment, more likely than not that they'll prevail at that level too. And then, of course, the only option would be the Supreme Court, and I don't have a lot of confidence this Supreme Court would rule against that case, which would result in chaos. And that's a terrible understatement for what would happen when 20 million people potentially lose their coverage and tens and tens and tens of millions more lose the protections that they enjoy now, especially those against the denial of treatment or coverage because that individual has a pre-existing condition. Here are the numbers, though, just to remind folks. Everyone's heard the number nationally. 133 million Americans, roughly, have a pre-existing condition. In my home state of Pennsylvania, that number is about a little more than 5.3 million people. Those numbers are terribly high, but I think the one that is really making an impression upon me, and I hope on others, especially those in Pennsylvania, is the number of children in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who have a pre-existing condition. 642,700 Pennsylvania children have a pre-existing condition. 642,700. No action by the United States Congress, by the administration, or by a court should ever result in any child being denied coverage or treatment because of a pre-existing condition. Any child, but let alone numbers that are so high and so offensive to even consider that number of children could be denied coverage, or any portion of that number could be denied coverage. So the only number I'll emphasize tonight is 642,700 Pennsylvania children with a pre-existing condition. I won't go through all the numbers because I know we're here late tonight, but another number that jumps out at me, and this number comes from a document published by Protect Our Care, telling us in a publication today that when you consider the donut hole coverage, meaning that the Affordable Care Act began to fill that coverage gap when an older American is paying for prescription drugs and often paying exorbitant prices for prescription drugs, the Affordable Care Act began to chip away at that number. So much and so in such a substantial fashion that on average, the average senior, since the Affordable Care Act was passed, and this is the period of time between 2010 and 2016, that senior on average gained $2,272 on average. It's almost $2,300 per senior to help them with their prescription drug costs by helping to fill that so-called donut hole, which is a very benign way to talk about a terrible coverage gap that burdens a lot of older Americans. In Pennsylvania, that number is lower, but it was still more than $1,100 per person. All of that is at risk if this case is successful. Just like pre-existing conditions are at risk, prescription drug coverage for seniors, or the support, I should say, that has in the recent past for prescription drug coverage for seniors, that support potentially could go away completely. So seniors are again footing the bill potentially if this lawsuit is successful. Two more, just for the record. Access to treatment would be in jeopardy for some 800,000 people with opioid use disorder issues. We know that there are a huge number of Americans that have a substance use disorder issue, often an addiction. A subcategory of that, and probably the biggest subcategory, are those with an opioid addiction. It's hurt families of all kinds, rich and poor, north and south, no matter where you live, east, west, rural, urban, suburban. It knows no bounds. All of that, or a lot of that, I should say, to be more accurate, a lot of that support has come from the support for quality treatment that folks need to lift themselves out of the grip of an addiction. a lot of that support comes from Medicaid expansion. And whether it's the repeal bills that were promoted here on the Senate floor over and over again, or whether it's the lawsuit that could change, could have as devastating an impact on health care as any repeal bill would, no matter where you turn in terms of Republican health care bills and in this lawsuit, you can see the adverse impact on Medicaid expansion. Virtually every one of them not only wanted to cut Medicaid expansion, in most of the Republican bills, they wanted to eliminate it over time, completely eliminate Medicaid expansion. That somehow it was wrong, and I have to ask why. Why was it wrong that millions of people got their health care through an expansion of Medicaid? Why would anyone ever doubt that someone next to you who doesn't have coverage first and foremost and might have an opioid addiction problem, why is that person getting coverage, and because they have coverage, insurance coverage, they can get treatment for that terrible scourge that our country is going to be dealing with for decades? Why is that the wrong thing to do? Why would taking that coverage away from someone with an opioid problem, why would that advance the interests of the American people? The answer is it wouldn't. The answer is it would set back the efforts to deal with a whole host of folks out there that are getting treatment today solely, completely, because of Medicaid expansion. And the last I'll mention is our rural areas. I represent a state that has 67 counties and 48 of them are rural. And a lot of the rural hospitals in those communities are teetering on the edge already and have been for years, and not just the last several years, for many years, teetering on the edge of collapsing. One of the fastest ways to ensure that more rural hospitals will close and collapse is to cut Medicaid or to take away Medicaid expansion. That has an adverse impact, the likes of which we can't even begin to calculate, because folks in rural Pennsylvania will lose coverage if you decimate Medicaid or you take away Medicaid expansion. But it doesn't end there. A lot of folks in those communities are getting treatment for an addiction issue or something related. They will be adversely impacted. Their families will, their communities will. But it doesn't stop there in a rural area. A lot of these rural areas, in my home state, and it's true all across the country, the biggest employer, or at least the second or third biggest employer in a rural county, is often a hospital. In my state, probably 25 counties were the top employer in those 48 rural counties, about half of them roughly. The number one or number two employer is a hospital. So cutting Medicaid or eliminating Medicaid expansion or sabotaging the health insurance markets or taking away the coverage of the Affordable Care Act has health care consequences, has opioid addiction treatment consequences, and of course has a job consequence as well. If you cut Medicaid in a lot of rural areas, you're going to lose a lot of jobs. Simple as that, and devastating though it is. So we have a long way to go to make progress on health care. And I hope that my Republican friends would come together with us and work on lowering the cost of health care, lowering the cost of prescription drugs. But they don't seem to be that interested in that. Some are, intermittently, once in a while, but they don't seem to be interested because there is an obsession here in the Senate on the Republican side with decimating the Medicaid program, ending Medicaid expansion, and completely wiping out all the gains of the Affordable Care Act. Now that would be bad enough, but it's doubly worse, or it's doubly insulting, I should say, when there's no plan for replacement. So what if a court of law, what if a federal court in the Fifth Circuit in the next couple of months says that the moving party here, the party that wants to declare the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional, what if the court declares the moving party is the prevailing party, that they win? And let's say it doesn't go to the Supreme Court, but even if it does, let's say it loses there. What happens then to those 20 million people who got coverage? What happens to the 150 million plus who have coverage today, protections today that they did not have before the Affordable Care Act. They were paying their premiums for years, if not decades. They had coverage for years, if not decades. Their children were covered maybe in their employer-sponsored plan, but they didn't have much protection from a pre-existing condition in many cases, maybe not in every. They didn't have protections against lifetime limits or caps on annual, the treatment you can get in a year or over a lifetime. And we had the bizarre and insulting and degrading experience where women were discriminated against in insurance because they were a woman. Being a woman was actually, in a sense, a pre-existing condition. That made no sense. Are we going to go back to those days? Because a group of attorneys general wanted to change the law, and they couldn't prevail on the Senate floor, or they couldn't prevail over time in the House, or by way of what the administration would do. So they went into court, and they're going to just wipe out coverage for tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans? Is that a good thing for America? I don't think so. I think that sends everything in the wrong direction. But unfortunately, that's not just theory. Some of it's already happening. As I said before, Gallup tells us 7 million fewer people have health care today, or at least as of January, than did 2 Januaries before that. So we have a long way to go to make progress on health care, but we're not going to make much progress around here if we have a continual fight. And I would hope that some would agree to set aside the fight about repeal and lawsuits taking away coverage, and let's work together to lower cost. Let's work together to lower the cost of prescription drugs in particular. Because I have to answer to a lot of families. One of them is a young man we spoke to today talking about his children, Matt Stefanelli, I should say, and Matt's son has type 1 diabetes. We are from the same home county, and he's worried not only about his own health care, but he's worried about his son's health care. We've got to answer, or have an answer to respond to families like Matt's.